It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to the book fair, as always. And, I'm here as moderator today, and we have two wonderful poets. So let me just talk about the event. Poetry Land is a very strange place. It holds few tangible rewards, yet there are thousands of poets seeking them, a riot of voices demanding attention, and no true consensus about what poetry is, was, or should be. Our most honored poets are not necessarily our best poets, and our best poets often not the most renowned. In Poetry Land, it turns out, qualifications do not always correlate with popular acclaim. Intelligence and skill do not always trump nonsensical bravado. And when the crowd selects its own champion, well, all bets are off. Today, we find ourselves in a far happier situation. Today, we are lucky enough to hear two poets who are not only among America's most distinguished and honored writers, but among its very best writers. Rita Dove and Robert Pinsky are, simply put, masterful at what they do. By which I mean, first and foremost, writing poems, where their excellence has been documented book after book for more than 4 decades. But they also share in serving as vital exponents for poetry in the American cultural marketplace, as essayists and thinkers, as renowned teachers, and of course, as past Poets Laureate of the United States. Certainly, we've had many fine poet laureates in recent decades. In fact, we had 2 of them here just last year for the same event, Kay Ryan and our current laureate, Juan Felipe Herrera. But I know that it is fair to say that Robert Pinsky and Rita Dove, with their mixture of gravitas and grace, of literary elan and popular appeal, have been poetry's most visible, effective, and impassioned public representatives during my lifetime. Let's please welcome Robert Pinsky and Rita Dove. So let me briefly explain our program. We're going to hear from our 2 poets, each of whom is going to read for about 15 minutes from their new books. Then we're going to hold a conversation here on stage, which will be largely fueled, I hope, and expect by your questions. As is traditional at the book fair, we're going to proceed alphabetically. I'm going to introduce first Rita, then after her reading, Robert. So, Rita Dove. Billie Holiday's burned voice had as many shadows as lights, Rita Dove writes in her poem Canary. And we could say the same about her own poetic voice, which sings in both those registers, which encompasses elegy and celebration, sorrow and joy. Rita Dove's new book is her collected poems, 1974 to 2004, bringing together her previous 7 collections. And it was a finalist for this year's National Book Award, the most recent in a voluminous list of honors. It would be virtually impossible, in fact, to list all of her accolades. Let me just mention that she has received over 25 honorary doctorates, as well as a National Medal of Arts from President Obama. In 1987, she received the Pulitzer Prize for Thomas and Beulah, her book-length sequence of poems that is by turns lyrical, narrative, and sociological, taking the lives of her 2 maternal grandparents as a template for the trajectory of African American life in the 20th century. Few contemporary books, it seems to me, have been more influential. From Tahimba Jess's Leadbelly to Adrian Matika's The Big Smoke, to the varied historical poetics of Natasha Trethewey, Kevin Young, Elizabeth Alexander, Rita Dove has shown succeeding generations how to make poetry from both personal life and communal narratives, how to sing songs full of both shadow and light. Today, if we're lucky, she'll show us how to do it as she shares her marvelous poems. Rita Dove.
Thank you. Thank you, Campbell. Thank you for that. It's wonderful to be here again at the Miami Book Fair. It grows and grows every year, and the joy grows with it. So it's It's wonderful to be here. I would like to take you on a journey of the life of a poet who just happens to have my name. Sometimes I feel like this book, which is a collection of 30 years of poems, was somehow written by somebody else. But first, let me give you a sense of where I come from. I come from the Midwest. I come from what we now know as the Rust Belt, but when I was growing up, it was a place vibrantly alive with jobs and with possibility. And the song that I remember most when I was about 10 or 12 was Hully Gully. Some of you might remember that. Hully Gully. Locked in bathrooms for hours, daydreaming in kitchens as they leaned their elbows into the shells of lemons, they were humming Hully Gully. Summer lasted a long time. Porch geraniums rocked the grandmothers to sleep as night slugged in, moon riding the sky like a drop of oil on water. Then down the swollen pitch of avenue, discourteous blouses, bright rifflings, gum popping to an invisible beat, daughters floating above the ranks of bobby socks. Theirs was a field to lie down in, while fathers worked swing shift and wives straightened oval photographs above the exhausted chenille in bedrooms upstairs everywhere. This next poem is one that's based on an actual historical event. I wish I could say that it wasn't based on fact. But the year is 1937. The country is the Dominican Republic. And on this particular day in October, the general, the dictator, Rafael Trujillo, ordered 20,000 Haitian cane workers to be executed for not being able to roll their R in the Spanish word for parsley. This poem is in two parts, and each part has a title. Parsley, the cane fields. There is a parrot imitating spring in the palace, its feathers parsley green. Out of the swamp the cane appears to haunt us, and we cut it down. El General searches for a word. He is all the world there is. Like a parrot imitating spring, we lie down screaming as rain punches through, and we come up green. We cannot speak an R. Out of the swamp the cane appears, and then the mountain we call in whispers Catalina. The children gnaw their teeth to arrowheads. There is a parrot imitating spring. El General has found his word, perejil. Who says it lives. He laughs, teeth shining out of the swamp. The cane appears in our dreams, lashed by wind and streaming, and we lie down. For every drop of blood, there is a parrot imitating spring. Out of the swamp, the cane appears. The palace. The word the general's chosen is parsley. It is fall, when thoughts turn to love and death. The general thinks of his mother, how she died in the fall, and he planted her walking cane at the grave, and it flowered, each spring stolidly forming 4-star blossoms. The general pulls on his boots. He stomps to her room in the palace, the one without curtains, the one with a parrot and a brass ring. As he paces, he wonders, who can I kill today? And for a moment, the little knot of screams is still. The parrot, who has traveled all the way from Australia in an ivory cage, is coy as a widow, practicing spring. Ever since the morning his mother collapsed in the kitchen while baking skull-shaped candies for the Day of the Dead, the general has hated sweets. He orders pastries brought up for the bird. They arrive dusted with sugar on a bed of lace. The knot in his throat starts to twitch. He sees his boots the first day in battle, splashed with mud and urine, as a soldier falls at his feet, amazed how stupid he looked at the sound of artillery. "I never thought it would sing," the soldier said, and died. Now the general sees the fields of sugarcane lashed by rain and streaming. He sees his mother smile, the teeth gnawed to arrowheads. He hears the Haitians sing without R's as they swing the great machetes. Catalina, they sing, Catalina, mi madre, mi amor en muerte. God knows his mother was no stupid woman. She could roll an R like a queen. Even a parrot can roll an R. In the bare room, the bright feathers arch in a parody of greenery as the last pale crumbs disappear under the blackened tongue. Someone calls out his name in a voice so like his mother's. A startled tear splashes the tip of his right boot. My mother, my love in death. The general remembers the tiny green sprigs men of his village wore in their capes to honor the birth of a son. He will order many this time to be killed for a single beautiful word. Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was a poem I wish it wasn't necessary to write. But I always tell my students, the poems choose you. You have no choice about whether you're going to write it. You have a choice about whether you're going to publish it. But you have to do it. Canary. Billie Holiday's burned voice had as many shadows as lights. A mournful candelabra against the sleek piano, the gardenia, her signature under that ruined face. Now you're cooking, drummer to bass, magic spoon, magic needle. Take all day if you have to, with your mirror and your bracelet of song. Fact is, the invention of women under siege has been to sharpen love in the service of myth. If you can't be free, be a mystery. I am leaping through the years. This poem, I'm a night person. I confess it proudly. My best hours are from midnight to 6 in the morning. And so I often see dawn on the other side of it. But Dawn Revisited. Imagine you wake up with a second chance. The blue jay hawks his pretty wares, and the oak still stands spreading glorious shade. If you don't look back, the future never happens. How good to rise in sunlight in the prodigal smell of biscuits, eggs, and sausage on the grill. The whole sky is yours to write on, blown open to a blank page. Come on, shake a leg. You'll never know who's down there frying those eggs if you don't get up and see. My mother was often the one frying those eggs, and I had to be pulled out of the bed, I must confess. But she was a remarkable seamstress. She took up being a seamstress when she was not allowed to go to college because she was too young. She had actually skipped 2 grades and then got a scholarship to Howard, but her parents said she was a young girl and they didn't want to let her out in Washington, D.C. So instead, she entered the workforce. My mother enters the workforce. The path to ABC Business School was paid for by a lucky sign. Alterations, qualified seamstress, inquire within. Tested on sleeves, hers never puckered. Puffed or sleek, leg of mutton or raglan, they barely needed the damp cloth to steam them perfect. Those were the afternoons. Evenings she took in piecework, the treadle machine with its locomotive whir traveling the lit path of the needle through quicksand taffeta or velvet deep as a forest. And now, sang the treadle, I know, I know. And then it was day again, all morning at the office machines, their clack and chatter, another journey, rougher, that would go on forever until she could break 100 words with no errors. And then no more postponed groceries and that blue pair of shoes. I always have a list, and then I always change it. So I would like to read this one in honor of all of my aunts, the aunts who took in piecework too, and who worked to put everybody else through schools and things like that, and also learned to do it with a smile so that we would not know how much it cost them. The Sisters' Swan Song. We died one by one, each plumper than the mirror saw us. We exited obligingly, rattling keychains and cocktail jewelry, rehearsing our ghostly encores. Glad to be rid of pin curls and prayers, bunions burning between ironed sheets, we sang our laments, praised God, and went our way quietly. Were mourned in satin and chrysanthemums, whiskey and cake, old gossip evaporating into cautionary tales. Does it matter who went first? Corinna or Faye, heartache or coronary, a reckless scalpel or a careless life? Whoever was left kept count on the dwindling rosary. Susanna, Kit, Mary, Violet, Pearl. We all died of insignificance. And I'll end with this one. Someone who was a great shining light, I think, for many of the women in my family. This was Hattie McDaniel, who, as you may remember, was the first African American to get an Oscar. She got it for her role as a maid in Gone with the Wind. And in those days, the Oscars were presented at the Coconut Grove. You had to walk around a corner and through a phalanx of cameras and well-wishers or ill-wishers in order to enter the venue. Hattie McDaniel arrives at the Coconut Grove late. In aqua and ermine, gardenia scaling her left sleeve in a spasm of scent, her gloves white, her smile chastened, purse giddy with stars and rhinestones clipped to her brilliantined hair, on her free arm that fine Negro, Mr. Wonderful Smith. It's the day that isn't, February 29th, at the end of the shortest month of the year. And the shittiest, too, everywhere except Hollywood, California, where the maid can wear mink and still be a maid, bobbing her bandaged head and cursing the white folks under her breath as she smiles and shoos their silly daughters in from the night dew. What can she be thinking of, striding into the ballroom where no black face has ever showed itself except above a serving tray? Hi-hat Hattie, Mama Mac, her haughtiness, the little lady from Showboat whose name Bing forgot, Beulah and Bertha and Melina and Carrie and Violet and Cynthia and Fidelia, one half of the dark Barrymores. Dear Mammy, we can't help but hug you, crawl into your generous lap, tease you with arch innuendos so we can feel that much more wicked and youthful and sleek. But oh, what we forgot. The 4 husbands, the phantom pregnancy, your famous parties, your celebrated icebox cake. Your giggle above the red petticoats rustle, black girl and white girl walking hand in hand down the railroad tracks in Kansas City, 6 years old. The man who advised you, now that you were famous, to begin eliminating your more common acquaintances, and your reply catching him square in the eye. That's a good idea. I'll start right now by eliminating you. Is she or isn't she? 3 million dishes, a truckload of aprons and head rags later, and here you are, poised between husbands and factions, no corset wide enough to hold you in, your huge face a dark moon split by that spontaneous smile, your trademark, your curse. No matter, Hattie. It's a long, beautiful walk into that flower-smothered standing ovation. So go on and make them wait. Thank you.
A country is the things it wants to see, Robert Pinsky proposes near the start of his book-length meditation on our national condition, An Explanation of America. I want for you to see the things I see and more: colonial diners, Disney, films of concentration camps, the napalm child trotting through famous news film in her diaper and tattered flaps of skin, deep throat, the rest. And so his readers have come to see the world for over 40 years, and dozens of books in many genres through Robert Pinsky's eyes and in his distinctive voice. Even non-readers have had their understanding of poetry shaped by Robert's looming presence as poet laureate and as a cultural adventurer who has managed to plant poetry's banner on such far-flung peaks of the zeitgeist as The Simpsons and The Colbert Report. Robert's new book, At the Foundling Hospital, continues his poetic investigation of what was once called the human condition in all its dialectical untidiness. His poems look in two opposing directions at once: inward toward psychology, at the mysteries of sexuality and love, the family and its discontents, and outward toward history and culture, music and language, belief systems, the texture of great cities, art in its endless ramifications, the Jewish tradition that informs his identity, and the American experience that defines it. If shadows and light provide an apt binary for Rita's work, for Robert's one might suggest sadness and happiness. Hey, that's pretty catchy. And it just happens to be the title of his very first book of poems, published by Princeton University Press in 1975. Today, 40 years and many poetic mountaintops later, it's a privilege to welcome Robert Pinsky.
Thank you so much, Campbell. It's a pleasure to be here at this great annual event with two poets I truly admire very, very much. I'm going before my new book at the Foundling Hospital is largely about culture and identity, and it approaches those things as not fixed, as hybrid and weird and mixed up. But in the spirit of kind of invocation, I'm going to read to you three quite short poems that are only sort of by me. First, here is a poem of mine based roughly on a 16th century Japanese poem, Samurai Song. When I had no roof, I made audacity my roof. When I had no supper, my eyes dined. When I had no eyes, I listened. When I had no ears, I thought. When I had no thought, I waited. When I had no father, I made care my father. When I had no mother, I embraced order. When I had no friend, I made quiet my friend. When I had no enemy, I opposed my body. When I have no temple, I made my voice my temple. I have no priest. My tongue is my choir. When I have no means, I make fortune my means. When I have nothing, death will be my fortune. Need is my tactic. Detachment is my strategy. When I had no lover, I courted my sleep. Second, I'm going to read to you my version of a 7-line poem by the great Nicaraguan poet Ernesto Cardenal. The title itself is a wonderful work of art. The title is Somoza unveils Somoza's statue of Somoza at the Somoza Stadium. It's not that I think the people erected this statue of me. No. I know better than you that I ordered it myself. And no, I don't have any illusions about passing with this statue into posterity, because I know the people one day will tear it down. No, nor did I wish to erect to myself in life the monument that I know you will not erect to me in death. No. I put up this statue just because I know you will hate it. In Spanish, sé que la odiáis. Odiáis. And the third of these poems, they're only sort of by me. I worked with Czesław Miłosz on this translation of his poem Incantation. I guess I have to say that Czesław did not mean this poem to be a description of the world as it is, but as an incantation to bring the world into being as it will and should be. Incantation. Human reason is beautiful and invincible. No bars, no barbed wire, no pulping of books, no sentence of banishment can prevail against it. It establishes the universal ideas in language and guides our hand so we write truth and justice with capital letters, lie and oppression with small. It puts what should be above things as they are. It is an enemy of despair and a friend of hope. It does not know Jew from Greek or slave from master, giving us the estate of the world to manage. It saves austere and transparent phrases from the filthy discord of tortured words. It says that everything is new under the sun. It opens the congealed fist of the past. Beautiful and very young are philosophia and poetry, her ally in the service of the good. As late as yesterday, nature celebrated their birth. The news was brought to the mountains by a unicorn and an echo. Their friendship will be glorious. Their time has no limit. Their enemies have delivered themselves to destruction. I said to you that I think of this book as being based on the idea that culture is mixed. I'm an opponent of purity in almost everything. I'm a great believer in mixture and mixed upness. I'll read you a poem called Mixed Chorus. The poem's inspired partly by realizing that the chorus in Greek tragedies, they speak in the first person singular, but they speak as many. They say I, but it's a bunch of guys dancing and chanting together. And my poem is called Mixed Chorus. It's spoken partly by the great American essayist and political figure W.E.B. Du Bois, but also by Irving Berlin and the Latin Roman poet Horace. Horace's father was a slave who earned his freedom. I know the word slave meant something somewhat different in the Roman Empire than it did in America, but still. And there are other speakers come into it. A lot of the poem is just simply lifted from Du Bois. Mixed Chorus. My real name is Israel Bailin. My father was a Roman slave who gained his freedom. I was first named Ralph Waldo Ellison, but I changed it to the name of one of your cities because I was born a Jew in Bielorussia. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. My other name is Flaccus. I wrote an essay on the theme, You Choose Your Ancestors. It won't be any feeble, conventional Ivy League wings that I'll rise on, not I, born of poor parents. Look, my ankles are changed already. New white feathers are sprouting on my shoulders. These are my wings. Across the color line, I summon Aurelius and Aristotle. Threading through Philistine and Amalekite, they come all graciously and without condescension. I took the name Irving or Caesar or Creole Jack. Someday, they'll study me in Hungary, in Newark, and in LA, so spare me your needless tributes. Spare me the red hideousness of Georgia. I wrote your white Christmas for you. And my third name, Burghardt, is Dutch. For all you know, I am related to Spinoza, Walcott, Pissarro, and in fact, my grandfather Burghardt's first name was Othello. Happens to be a fact that W.E.B. Du Bois's grandfather's name was Othello Burghardt. Go figure. A friend of mine was in a coma, and what they do sometimes when you're in a coma is people sing to you, they tell you stories, they tell you jokes, they remind you of things that you used to know. In this case, it didn't work. Alan died after a couple of weeks of this, but for me, it dredged up, what are all the things that I might name that might trigger something in him? So in a way, it was diving into the coma myself, trying to imagine that cavern, that dark place, and trying to think, what could I put into it that I, more than anybody else, I knew him, we met when we were teenagers, what could I, in the coma. My friend was in a coma, so I dove deep into his brain to word him back. I tried to sing Hallelujah, I Just Love Her So in Ray Charles's voice. Of course, the silence grew. I couldn't sing the alphabet song. My voice couldn't say words I knew because I could not stop for death. He kindly stopped for me. I couldn't remember the Dodgers and the Giants. I tried to tell him the stories he and I studied when we were young. It was all mixed up. The invisible man was laughing at how a man felt history jump out of his head and beat him half to death as being the nightmare out of which Isaac Babel tried to awake. The quiet. Next time, won't you sing with me? Those great diminished chords. A girl I knew. The cold of the coma. Lightless. The ocean floor. I tried to tell things back from decades gone. The mournful American soldier testifying about My Lai. I shot the older lady. Viola Liuzzo. Spiro Agnew. Jim Jones. And by the time I count from 1 to 4, I hear her knocking, quiet of the deep. Our mouths are open, but we cannot sing. Here's a poem called Creole. Creole. I'm sick of the gods. I'm pious about the ancestors, afloat in the wake widening behind me in time, those restive devisers. My father had one job from high school till the day he got fired at 30. The year was 1947, and his boss, planning to run for mayor, wanted to hire an Italian veteran, he explained, putting it in plain English. I was 7 years old. My sister was 2. The barbarian tribes in the woods were so savage the empire had to conquer them to protect and clear its perimeter. So into the woods, Rome sent out missions of civilizing governors and forces to establish schools, courts, garrisons, soldiers, clerks, priests, citizens with their household slaves. Years, decades, entire lives were spent in those hinterlands, which might be good places to retire on a government pension, especially if in your work years you had acquired a native wife. Often I get these things wrong, or at best mixed up, but I do feel piety toward those persistent, mixed families in Gaul, Britain, Thrace. When I die, may I take my place in the wedge widening and churning in the mortal ocean of years of souls. The Roman colonizing and mixing, the imperial processes of legal enslaving and freeing involved not just the inevitable fucking, in all senses of the word, but also marriages and births as developers and barbers, scribes and thugs mingled and coupled with the native people and peoples. Begetting and trading, they had to swap, blend, and improvise languages. Couples, especially, needed to invent French, Spanish, German, those Creole languages. And I confess, I, Roman, barbarian, I find that Creole work more glorious than God. The way it happened, the school sent around a notice. Anybody interested in becoming an apprentice optician, raise your hand. It was the Great Depression. Anything about a job sounded good to Milford Pinsky, who told me he thought it meant a kind of dentistry. Anyway, Milford was bored sitting in study hall, so he raised his hand. And he got the job, as was his destiny, full-time after he graduated. Joe Chavone was the veteran who took the job. Not a bad guy. Dr. Weinberg did get elected mayor. Joe worked for him for years. At the bank, John Smuck, an Episcopalian whose family once owned the bank, had played sports with Milford. And he gave him a small loan with no collateral, so he opened his own shop, grinding lenses and selling glasses. As his mother-in-law said, almost a professional. Optician comes from a Greek word that has to do with seeing. Banker comes from an Italian word for a bench, where people sat to make loans or change. Pinsky, like Tex or Brooklyn, is a name nobody would have if they were still in that same place. Those names all signify somebody who's been away from home for a while. Schiavone, or Schiavone, means a Slav or slave. Milford is a variant on the poets' names: Milton, Herbert, Sidney, that certain immigrants used to give to their offspring. And Creole comes from a word meaning to breed or to create in a place. Thank you.
What a wonderful reading. Thank you both so much for being with us and sharing your work and wisdom and intelligence and kind of an aura of just great language that's still hanging in the room, I think. And I know people will have a lot of questions, so we're going to get to those. We had a very interesting conversation this morning about many things, but so I just wanted to just raise a few topics that I thought would be of interest. One of which is which we just heard in your work, the insistence on poetry as a medium that can look outward and document culture, the world, history, larger experiences than the self. I feel like American poetry has been in a lyric age of the self and the self's concern, and I'm always so moved by poets who, while singing their own songs, also sing the song of larger things in the world. And I wonder how that came to seem to either of you an important part of the poetic enterprise.
They're all looking at me. Can you hear? Is it on? Yes, it is. All right. I grew up seeing two different kinds of histories, two different stories being told, and then later on I realized there were many, many layers of that. The one that I could see was the one of a history of African American lives, which was not appearing in any history book, or if it was markedly different from the way that I saw people experiencing it in my family and in the community. So I was fascinated by this fact that there were all these stories which were being dropped out of history. And when I began writing, though, I do think writing is an intensely intimate activity, and reading is an intensely intimate activity as well. There is that feeling of all of us being alone together and intimate together. Still, I felt that I wanted to tell those stories. So that's how it started for me. Of course, there is the personal story and a kind of a public voice that can happen as well. But the initial impulse came from that disconnect that I saw in my life.
Yeah. But Thomas and Beulah was your third book.
Yes.
So you sang the song of the self, and then maybe moved towards larger songs or narratives, or maybe that was just happenstance rather than any grand plan.
Well, Thomas and Beulah was a book. I mean, it was actually the one that I felt that I got finally close to the personal, because my first two books were less personal. There was a reserve there, a feeling of, well, I don't want to sing the song of myself, whatever that is. I want to explore the world. Thomas and Beulah became the song of a marriage and of two selves as they lived in the world, and so I was gradually pushing out toward the world. Let's put it that way.
I understand. And Robert, I mean, I wonder if that's in any way analogous to your trajectory. Exploration America was not the first, but an early enterprise.
Yeah, I did write a book called An Explanation of America. I think it did reflect, I think I had somehow a sense very early on of how many cultural streams combine in any one person. And my parents were nominally Orthodox Jews, but they were actually very secular people. They'd been in the town. They went to the same high school as me. They were expert dancers. Perhaps not as good as you and Fred, but they won a mambo contest one night when I was playing in the band at the Elks Club. And I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan when Jackie Robinson came into the major leagues, and I say it that way partly because he was my favorite player, not because he was a moral hero. I was too young to understand that. He was my favorite player because he was so daring. It was the base stealing. I didn't understand the moral and cultural forces behind his combination of daring and dignity. I didn't have those words. I just knew I liked him the most. And it was also when rock and roll was being born. There was no YouTube, so you couldn't see that the blues and that black music had been, you can see breakdancing done in the 20s, some of the same moves. Now, then I just had this vague sense of that. I had a vague idea that we were a minority, and that indeed black kids had the same kind of names that we called American, and in fact belonged to the majority religion. And I grew up in a neighborhood that was part what we now call African American or black. The accepted terminology then was colored. There were colored kids, Italian kids, Jewish kids, Irish kids, and the town was historic. Long Branch, New Jersey was a summer capital. President Garfield died there. And the history of my immigrant grandparents and the immigrant grandparents of the Citadinos, and where we all came from was in an inchoate, confused way one of the things I was trying to understand and think about, and it has never stopped.
That's the sense of identity, in other words, is really, my question, in other words, is kind of boundless because the self and the larger things are so inextricably interwoven that that's really a false thought. I want to pick up on something that you just mentioned, Robert, though, which is that, Rita, you're an avid and accomplished ballroom dancer with your husband, Fred, and Robert, you're a musician, and in fact, I've gotten used to seeing you reading with jazz musicians on the stage with you. And just how it is that those other arts have influenced your poetry, how the arts intertwine in such a complicated way, and what you think about that intermixing.
Well, I grew up surrounded with music and began playing cello when I was 10, only because there was still music in the schools in those days, and they asked me what instrument I wanted to play, and they said violin or cello, and cello sounded good. I should have known I was going to be a poet at that point, but I just chose cello, and then I saw it, and I thought, wow. But I played cello, and it sensitized me, let's say, to the various musics that any instrument can make, and that's not only musical instruments, but the human voice. Every language has its own music. I just have to have music in my life. And in fact, I almost became a music major, but I was so shy that my knee would shake when I was trying to play a solo. With cellos, that's never good to have your knee shake. And so I remember deciding in college, well, I'll go to literature and then we'll see what happens. But and so I kept music in my life, and it's true that I kept it going, and in the end began dancing with my husband. So bringing in what that has done, it's not only, I think it has influenced the writing a lot, because if a poem does not have its own musical cage of sound, for me, I'm not interested in a poem of mine that doesn't have some kind of cage or sound. Sometimes it's an ugly one, but it's its own music. But I think that in moving all the way to dancing, it's getting the physical back in it, the entire body into thought, okay? And it actually helped. I think in terms of my writing, it actually energized it, though someone else can say it better than I, because I don't know. I'm just going to write the poems. Okay.
That's understandable. Robert, I know,
Campbell, in our conversation earlier, Campbell talked about how many students he has seem to think of poetry as something they see on a page, and he calls attention to the process that it is vocal. To me, the art it's fundamental. Poetry is fundamental and basic in the way that music, singing, and dancing are fundamental. Mm-hmm. We want it. I've learned that when I'm holding a baby, the baby that you're comforting or soothing, the baby curls into you and is comforted exactly the same way if you sing to the baby or if you recite to the baby. The baby is not making a distinction. It's a human voice, it's cadenced, it's doing basically the same thing. And my first ambition was to be, the joke I always make is, I really would have become a great jazz saxophonist. I would have been famous great jazz saxophonist. The single obstacle of a deficiency of talent. It's the only thing that stopped me. And I go back to my subject of culture. I think music kept me alive through high school. I had a very hard time from about the 7th or 8th grade on. My one identity, the one thing I did right, is I was the music. In my graduating class, definitely not most literary, most musical boy. And that's thanks to a man whom we called Mr. Winthrop. He was the music man of Long Branch. And Mr. Winthrop gets the 5th graders lined up, and he hands them either a brass mouthpiece or a clarinet mouthpiece. And I took the clarinet mouthpiece and I went, I made a noise. And Mr. Winthrop says, okay, then you'll go to there. His accent. And I realized, it was like 15 or 20 years later, I realized, of course, his name must have been Weintraub. He must have been an immigrant. And he took a quintessentially waspy American name. which I've never talked about that in a piece of writing or a poem, but for me it's part of the same wondering at identity and the shimmering, odd, largely fabricated nature of identity. And thanks to Mr. Winthrop, whose immigrant story I don't know, probably he fled the Nazis.
We're going to be here just a few more minutes. I want to alert you guys to please, there's a microphone in the middle where if you want to ask a question, I think, rather than bring the microphone to you, I think you need to go to it. And while you want to come to the microphone so we can hear you, want to say it? And I can probably translate it if you, or Michael can help us with that.
Come up to the microphone if you have a question.
You see, I'm pointing at the microphone. It's here in the middle. If you can, maybe can't
It's
see
right
where
up
I'm pointing.
right there. Come on up. Don't be shy.
You taking questions?
That's good.
There's a poem that goes, and Mr. Pinsky, you read it a few years ago. It starts, I have no parents, I make the heavens and earth my parents. I have no home, I make awareness my home. I have no life or death, I make the tides of breathing my life and death. And when you read it a couple of years ago, do you recall?
I think you're describing the poem I began with, that I read.
I'm sorry, I missed the very beginning.
Yeah. That poem is called Samurai Song, and it was inspired, I do this project, Favorite Poem, go to favoritepoem.org, you'll see ordinary folks reading poems by Whitman, Langston Hughes, etc. At one of those readings, I discovered this Japanese poem that I sort of rip off a bit, that I'm copying in my poem.
Right, and
it's
that's
called Samurai Song.
That's what I wanted to ask about, because when you read it a couple of years ago, and I apologize, I missed the beginning, Joseph Goldstein in his book Insight Meditation quotes that, has that, and describes it as a 13th century samurai poem. So now I understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, and we got another question.
Hi. So about maybe 10 years ago, and hello to everyone on the stage. So maybe about 10 years ago or more or less, Rita Dove, you were here for the evenings with, and I remember you danced on the stage with your husband, and you signed my book, and I told you that I had studied with Campbell McGrath, and I told you that I was working on a book of poetry about Jane Eyre poems, and you signed my book for Rita, who has the right name, because my name is Rita, for Rita, who has the right name and high hopes. And today I read from that book, and I wanted to tell you that I had told you that the reason that I was writing that book was because I had read the book Mother Love, and it was all about, Persephone and Demeter and Hades, and that was one of the first books of poetry that I had ever read that made me care about poetry. Coincidentally, Campbell had assigned it in class when I was his student a while back, and it changed my life. And I just wanted to know, your book gave me so much. Can I give you my book?
Oh, yes.
Congratulations, Rita. We're proud of you.
I am proud of you, and that's the best thing anyone could have said to me. And you have to sign it. I told her she can't leave without signing her book.
Another question?
How can I top that? Hello, Miss Rita. How are you? You inspire me so much. I'm a beginner of writing, and I just wanted to know, what challenges did you had to overcome for you to get to where you are, so I could be able to, what's the right word, prepare myself.
Oh, how the best. Oh. Well, the challenge that every, I think, writer has to overcome or walk a step up to, let's say, you have to believe that you can sing, and that you have your own voice, and that it is an important voice to hear. You have to believe in that multiplicity of dialects, the Creole that comes out, that we are all sufficiently mixed up together, that even the most private, the quirkiest thing the most intimate thing that you have to say can find resonance in every person in this room. And that is, it is the nature of being human. It's what I think a poet it keeps bringing out of us when we read their work. But and it's a tricky thing to do. I mean, you have to really believe that, yeah, this story that I have or this way that I see something is, people might think I'm crazy, but they really won't, because we all can see it. So, you do have to believe that.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for the questions.
Okay. And are there any more questions?
Well, I think we
is
could
that
talk for
Jonathan
another.
coming?
We could talk for another hour, but I think we have to let these guys go because I know Robert has an airplane,
We'll have one,
and we have
let's
a book
one,
signing.
one or two more questions.
Okay, go ahead, Michael.
And then
You're the boss.
yes, I am.
Okay.
Thank
I
you.
was briefly reading both of your biographies, and I saw that you two have a lot in common. Poet laureates, professors, but I was looking at your parents. With your father being a chemist and your father being an optician, what was the role of science, or is there any role of science in what you are doing now, or what developed you?
How nice to be asked about that, the role of science. Rita's father was a chemist, I believe, and though my father, optician, was a trade, he was quite good at it. He learned it, he studied it. I think the old meaning of science as knowledge, as knowing, applies also to the previous question, but how do you overcome difficulties? Rita's answer was good, but as I with the Rita before that, you find your models. And like a scientist, if you love the poems of Emily Dickinson, or of Robert Hayden, or of Wallace Stevens, you read them the way a cook eats, or the way a filmmaker looks at film. And I think I learned from my father that if you're going to do something, try to know as much as you can. Don't just learn it, study it. And that for me is a beautiful idea of knowledge. And it's why I wasn't good at it, but I liked the things I managed to learn about science in high school and college. I think it's a good model. The scientist is a good model for the poet, and I wish it were serving as a better model for politicians as well.
Oh my God, yes.
We have two more questions. The two questioners who are up there now. Those will be the last two questions.
I just wanted to thank you all for what you've done for poetry. And Rita, when I met you, when you first came down after you you became poet laureate, Robert, I started an email bulletin when I started by fax when I started a favorite poem reading, inspired by you. Campbell, your classes in Ireland in 2000, and Michael, you've always been a wonderful friend of poetry. But all of you have been inspirations to me in my love of poetry. And I just wanted to finish on that. You're all wonderful inspirations and dedicated to poetry. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We do have one more question. Thank you, Jonathan.
I really enjoyed hearing all of you speak today. I have a question related to a talk we had just before with Colson Whitehead. And he describes how once he's got a project going, he goes to his literally private space and he works half a day, cranks out 2, maybe 3 pages. In a week, sounds like a good week, is going to be maybe 8 or 9. So I'm wondering, when the spirit moves you, how do you literally set pen to paper? And I'm thinking that you need to do this because this is the way you make a living. So it's not every once in a while, maybe I'll write a poem. So I understand the inspiration, but as I say, when the spirit moves you, how do you actually go about constructing an anthology or just a body of work?
use one expression that isn't accurate. I've heard Rita say things that confirm that isn't accurate about her or me. You said set pen to paper. Often it begins here. You can have both hands on the steering wheel. You can be taking a shower, and you're working very hard at, as though you were a literal musician, composing, trying to make a phrase. And it's staying with the material. And the material is the vowels and the consonants and the sounds of the sentences. And you must keep working at it and thinking about it and studying it. It's hard work, though to someone watching, you're just driving. You're just taking a shower. I mean, we may be composing right now.
You will not know.
But does this come about in a protracted way? Or is
Everybody's
this
different in their work habits.
Yeah, everyone's different. I mean, I will, if at the moment when I'm actually at the desk writing, I will write in fragments. But Robert's absolutely right. It's already begun back here. So I will write something down that has been in my head for a while, or maybe in a notebook, and I've just joined it with something else, but I'm listening. And often I will write down something in the very middle of the page, because I hear everything else around it, but I don't have the words yet. I just have the cadences, and I have the vowels, everything, all of that. But it is also persistence. You just sit down and you work. And coming from a scientific family, you keep trying things out that eventually the words will find their emotion and the meaning, and they'll join together. It's a combination of both.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you all three.